People have a lot of trouble understanding gauge in loom knitting, and there are some good reasons for that, because gauge can mean a great many things. I most often think of gauge in terms of how many stitches per inch I get. Here I used 3 different yarns on 2 different looms and got different gauges, even though the looms are usually described as being the same gauge, in that their pegs are spaced the same distance apart. But gauge could also refer to the thickness of the yarn. This is the yarn I'm planning to use for my next project and the reason for checking gauge. It's a number 5 yarn. We all call that bulky or sometimes chunky, but the results may possibly be different on 2 looms of the same nominal gauge. And as you can see, mine were different. And why do we care? It's so that the size of what we're knitting comes out as expected. Here's an example. At first glance, the 2 gauges on the 2 different looms don't seem all that different. After all, they're both between 3 and 4 stitches per inch. But look what happens if we get it wrong. At 3.3 stitches per inch, I need 67 to make the front of a 40-inch sweater. At 3.6 stitches per inch, I need 72 stitches. Were I to use 72 stitches on the loom that gets the looser gauge, my sweater would come out 3.6 inches larger than I intended. Going the other way, it would come out 3 inches too small. That's more of a difference than most of us want to see after all our hard work. There are some projects for which it wouldn't matter much, and as long as you get an acceptable fabric, you don't really need to swatch. I don't really care if the baby blanket comes out the 28 inches I intended. 29 and 30 would do, 27 would do. The hat, on the other hand, must be correct to within a quarter of an inch to fit properly. And that's why we swatch and need to know how do the looms compare. Both of these looms have a spacing of 5/8 of an inch from center to center of the pegs. This one's made by Authentic Knitting Board. This one's made by Cindy Wood. And though this one was custom made for me, the spacing and the pegs themselves are something Cindy Wood offers standard. What's unique is that I have it as a double knitting board, which is not on her list, and there's a feature that can make my pegs offsettable. But the board and the pegs and the gauge are completely normal Cindy Wood stuff. These are mass marketed and they are factory made, so you don't get to choose, but this is the chunkiest board that they make. I first discovered the significant gauge difference between the two when I was making this hat for my husband. I was using leftover yarn from a sweater that I really love and I'm familiar with loom knitting, and it was proving extremely hard to knit over the stitches. When that happens, usually the yarn is too big for the loom. My usual knit stitch of choice is the U-wrap. In this case, you can probably see in the photos of the 2 hats I made that changing to the E-wrap stitch did the trick, because E-wrapped knit stitches are looser and larger than U-wrapped stitches. Well, in many ways, I prefer the Cindy Wood loom of the 2. This one allowed me to make those decreases on the crown in a simple way that made the hat fit very well. So here I am doing the first batch of swatches on the KB loom using the U-wrap stitch that I plan to use for the project. This is puzzle yarn. While I was swatching, I also swatched the orange, which is a number 4 yarn, and another green yarn, which is the one in the sweater that I'm wearing. It's a number 5 yarn. I already knew that while knitting this sweater on the Cindy Wood loom, I had gotten 3.3 stitches per inch, but just to be sure, I removed the swatch from the KB loom and moved it over to the Cindy Wood loom and made swatches of the same 3 yarns on the Cindy Wood loom. I'm not that happy with the number 4 yarn on the Cindy Wood loom. I think it's too loose and floppy. But both number 5s are delightful. And although the yarns are not identical, they never are, the two got the same gauge. When knitting number 4 yarn in plain stockinette, I generally aim for 4 stitches per inch. This came out 3.6 on the KB loom, and I like this fabric okay. I would use this loom and this yarn together, at least for some purposes, though it is a little looser than my preference. The two number 5 yarns did produce presentable knitting, and I would wear it for something where firmness was good, like a hat perhaps. It is stiffer fabric than I would like for a sweater. And here's why I think the two looms produce a different gauge, even though the peg spacing is identical. The thickness of the pegs is not identical. Cindy wood pegs are clearly thicker. I think it's also possible that the rounder shape is conducive to letting the U-wrap form. So I hope that all helps you understand gauge a little bit better and where it's important. Vary for garments, much less so for things like scarves and blankets.